Welcome to this episode of the Talent Forge, where we are shaping the future of training and development. Today, I am joined by special guest Barb Thompson. Welcome to the show, Barb.
Thanks for having me.
So, you have an incredible history, and I should say, Dr. Thompson. We'll keep it colloquial for now, but I would love for our audience to get to know you and the work that you're doing because I think it's so critical, so important, and it actually hits pretty deeply home for me. Why don't you go ahead and take a minute to introduce yourself and tell us how you got into this talent development space too?
Okay, sounds great. I'll give you the nutshell version if I can do that. So,
Sure.
I'm originally born and raised in Oklahoma, and so I still call that home, go there about once a year. But eventually, my dream was always to get out and see the world. And I never thought that I would become a psychologist or a scientist of any kind. In fact, it was just such a natural interest for me that I couldn't stop. I just kept going. And I ended up getting my doctorate in clinical psychology. But then I joined the Army, and that's when my career and really personal life and fulfillment took a took a sharp turn and steep slope, all kinds of things, because I learned about this other side of psychology that I just really, frankly, didn't know about. I joined the Army to help service members, and then I was introduced to what's called operational psychology. So it is, taking behavioral scientists, people who have studied their whole lives and become familiar with human behavior, and then putting them in a consultative space in all kinds of different arenas. And so I just fell in love. I knew instantly when I heard about it that that was for me. As weird as that sounds, if we get into more of the specifics, people might think I'm crazy. Um, but that was what I did in the Army, and then married a service member, a special forces officer, and then at some point, us being gone at the same time just didn't make sense for our kids and everything. So I got out and did some reserve time with the Army, and then have been a contractor for the military, one unit or another, since that period of time. So that's me in a nutshell. I also have just found a lot of fulfillment in keeping the relationships that I've made in those military units. And, those people go on to just do some amazing things, nonprofits and other organizations that, I'm just happy to be a part of in any way. So I think that's
So
it.
amazing. Let me start off by saying thank you for your service. Thank your husband for his service. And, my brother was 82nd Airborne in the Rangers. And so
Yeah.
I understand I do have at least some understanding, and I'm not going to say I understand personally, but I do have some understanding of the challenges and some of the different navigational, barriers that you have and that you're dealing with. So you're actually, and I definitely want to get into the operational psychology a little bit because I find that so fascinating. And when I was reading your profile, I was like, damn, I might have missed a calling here. Like that would have been super interesting
Yeah.
to me.
There's still
Um,
time.
So that's incredible. I definitely want to dig into that because I do find it really fascinating. And in particular, with our audience being trainers, coaches, and HR people,
Hmm.
there's a lot I'm sure that they can learn from some of your experiences and knowledge in that space. But I kind of want to start with one thing. You're working with obviously some of the highest performing leaders in the world, right? In these high in these military positions. I saw that you had started a leadership program inside of this space. What was that experience like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's difficult for me to answer that. What was it like? So I think that uh, going to work for me every day was exciting and challenging. You don't really know. I kind of felt at home already in that space, having been in the Army and kind of grown up around like special operations folks. And so I didn't find it particularly unfamiliar, but I will say that sometimes what the characteristics that an individual might have in order to get them to a certain level might also be the same characteristics that make it somewhat difficult to influence them. Does
Mhm.
that make sense?
Oh, it makes a ton of sense. So, uh,
Okay.
it makes way too much sense for me because one of my strongest biological drives. So, I talk a lot about the biological drives that Dr. Paul Lawrence and Dr. Nitin Noria had put out with their book Driven, How Human Nature Shapes Our Choices. I have a very strong drive to acquire. I'm highly competitive. I want to win. I want to win big. And I've realized that while that helped drive me in so many of my different places, it also held me back until I learned how to
Mm-hmm.
balance some of those things where I could actually listen to other people more effectively, where I could actually collaborate more effectively, et cetera. So it really resonates with me. Now, when you're working with these high performance leaders, and that can be a little bit intimidating. I know some of our audience have actually gotten this question like, hey, I just got put into a place where I am working with these sets of leaders, and I've experienced it too. When I was coaching with the NASA's executive leadership team, it was one of the first times in my entire career that I started to feel almost like a little bit of imposter, like, what the hell am I doing here?
Yes.
Yeah,
Should I turn
how?
around now?
Yeah, exactly. Like, okay, they have 1,000 years of space flight experience, and I'm going to walk in and talk about behavioral science. Okay, so how did you manage that? Because I presume at some point in time you may have had a little of that feeling or a little of that apprehension.
Oh yeah.
Are they
Yes.
going to take me seriously? Do they think, yeah. How did you manage that? How did you overcome that? Because obviously you were incredibly successful in your career, and I think it would be really insightful to our audience to hear that.
Yes. If I go off track, keep me on this question because it's such a good question. And I think that a lot of organizations or teams are missing out on the expertise within their walls because of what you're talking about here.
Mhm.
So I would say absolutely. I felt like I was not worthy. I would say to kind of uh, be be in the same four walls as some of these individuals, knowing what they've done and what they've sacrificed, and having seen, just to be really frank with you, like their personality profiles, how smart they are, their IQ tests, really intimidating group to be around. Um, but I will say a couple of things helped me. The first one is just knowing that they're professionals. They're so focused on their mission. They're not really concerned about you being at the same caliber with the same expertise. And in fact, that's not why you're there at all. You're there because you're different, right? Like you're there
Mhm.
because you're focusing on something completely different that may be additive to the processes and the products and the missions that they're going after. So reminding myself of that really helped. And honestly, just ripping off as many band-aids as possible. So how many conversations can I have? How many encounters can I get into where the fear of having those conversations continues to decrease over time? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Okay.
anytime that we're starting something new, engaging in something uncertain, the more certain
Yep.
it becomes, the less anxiety that we feel, the less
Yep.
cortisol, all that. So
All of
just
that.
getting in there and starting was kind of
Yep.
one of the strategies that got you through.
Yes. And then the last piece would be putting out just putting out information and soliciting those conversations in a way that matters to the environment. And one way I did that, there's a couple of ways, but I put out a newsletter. It's kind of old school, but when you're in a small environment and you're talking directly, like you can be a conduit of the themes that you see going on around you, especially as a person who observes behavior, right? Observes
Mhm.
themes in human behavior, kind of observes and understands the undercurrent. They're focusing kind of down and in on these problems, and you can kind of focus up and out and look at the organization as a whole and see different themes and then present them with information that's helpful for solving the problems that you see that they're having, right? So um I just tried to start by being helpful. And I think by focusing on yourself or focusing on like how unworthy you may feel or having that imposter syndrome, that's really self-focused. And you want to take the focus off of yourself, I think, if you want to contribute in a way that's really meaningful. And so I'm always just trying to look at the individual or at the team or at the organizations like, what am I noticing here? Like, what about what I know about psychology can be helpful for them? And I don't have to win the world over, right? Like I'm just putting out principles that are already out there in behavioral science that may, again, incrementally help what they are doing. And so the newsletter was helpful for that. The newsletter started conversations that I would have never had started had I just been walking the halls, if that makes
Mm,
sense. And
yeah.
then the last piece is that, one of the specialties, whether you're talking about coaching or behavioral science, is that we know a lot about assessments and we have all different kinds to use, at our disposal, lots of different tools. And I have found that by first saying, hey, here, take this assessment, everyone is curious about themselves.
Yep.
Everyone's curious
That's
about
true.
themselves. And most assessments don't take long to complete. And so if I would send them links now, of course, for the people I'm working with, they've already been assessed and selected. So they've
The
taken these like,
battery, I'm
yeah,
sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So they're like, what's one more? And the important thing is never, never put out an assessment without putting aside the time to debrief the people and give them something valuable from the assessment. Don't just throw it out there. That's kind of like worst case scenario, right? Like tie it to a theme, a problem that you're seeing that that they want to have solved, and then and emphasize the debrief. And we ended up making the debriefs of these assessments like part of um how we functioned at the unit. So when people would come in after assessment and selection, they've taken the full kind of psychological battery. We would give them another one. And then we had like an introductory course, kind of like an onboarding. And we would debrief them and just have those discussions about, hey, here's the norms for this environment. I found that people really like to know the norms and then where they
Mm.
sit in regards to the norms for that environment. All of that's super helpful information. The natural curiosity is already there, and you really will be helping improve the way that they interact with the people around them with that additional information. So those are some of the ways that I try to overcome, because it's even now, I mean, I find myself like more grateful than anything else and kind of like leaning on the experience, like that the little things that you have to offer are helpful. But even now, I would say that it's intimidating. So,
There's so much insight in what you just said. I'm going to pull a couple of things out. First of all, I love that you just said, I'm grateful. This is something that I really try to hammer into trainers and coaches. Be like, what are you grateful for? Get into that sort of mindset of, I'm grateful for this opportunity, this experience. In a worst case scenario, what ends up happening? Maybe it doesn't land. Okay, that's okay. Get in there and do it again and again and again. The repetition, and all of a sudden, we start to be much more confident. But one
mhm,
thing that I so appreciate that you said, Barb, was where you said, I have a unique insight or I have a different perspective. And I think that's so powerful, right? Because me walking into NASA, I'm not going to teach them rocket science. I'm not a mathematician by any stretch of the imagination, but I did have something unique that maybe they hadn't experienced before, or a perspective that might open up something for them. And that was what I relied on. So you saying that really just kind of resonated with me. Um, as somebody who has developed an assessment, I could not 100% agree with you more. It's that sort of like debrief. It's that, hey, let's go through this and get a better understanding. Let's get some questions answered. And I think that that's one of the most powerful ways that we really can make a really interesting impact is having people go through a discovery after they take an assessment. Nobody reads the reports, right? They look at the scores, they
right,
like, they do the
gibberish.
yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. They do the general, F read. Okay, I'll read these three sentences down to the middle and read this, and then okay, that's enough, and put it away. So the fact that you're debriefing on them, I'm sure helped to build a relationship, but also probably
Yes.
gave them and you significant insights.
Yeah. When it comes down to it, the relationship is always the most important part. Like however the conversation starts, almost doesn't even matter. Like once you get into the conversation, you they'll discover kind of what unique attributes and skill sets you have to bring to the table, especially in these high performing environments, because they are thinking two steps ahead. They're already thinking strategically, right? They're already so focused on what could be helpful or what might be harmful. And so you don't really even have to do that work for them if you just show up, you know,
Hmm.
and be willing and courageous enough to start the conversations and hold on to those relationships.
Well, and I'll be honest with you, Barb, I've worked with high performance leaders and I've worked with low performance leaders, and I'll take high performance leaders every day and twice on Sunday. It just makes the work more, I don't know, it feels better, right? It feels like you're actually making a difference when that occurs. But sometimes we do have to work with leaders that maybe are not at the level that we'd like.
For sure.
What is maybe one of the ways in which you approach that situation? Maybe you encountered some, and obviously names and everything left out, changed to protect the guilty and or the innocent. But when you find that person in that leadership position that's maybe struggling, or maybe is just not aware of some of the barriers or challenges that they're facing, or maybe unwilling to change, how did you approach that? Because I can imagine that lessons from sort of your experience in that military side would be really, really advantageous for those of us not in the military side as well. How did you overcome those
Hopefully.
barriers? Yeah.
S- Yeah, so a couple of different things. You might hear about it one way or another. I think that kind of the informal route is how I heard about kind of leadership issues most, is that people, tend to talk about their frustrations with other team members. And then sometimes, it's just very blatant, like, ooh, like this person may not know about the effect that they're having on the environment. And so, to it's not simple to get something like this enacted in a culture, especially depending on how they react to feedback or kind of what their stance is on feedback in the first place. But what we did is made kind of like normalized giving feedback, and I still don't think it's a normal thing that people do. I think it costs time, it costs effort, and there's some interpersonal risk that most of us don't grow up like being taught how to have difficult conversations. But I do think that that is one area where high performing teams, when they're willing to do that, excel uh, exponentially. And
Yeah.
so we really relied on feedback to give everyone insight, right? And we'd have the leader go first. And we would be there, and most of the time we would kind of say, oh, this is how it starts. We used a stop, start, continue method. It was really short, it
Hmm.
was behaviorally anchored. So it's not an emotional process. You've got 2 minutes. What should this person, you know, start, stop, or keep on doing to be successful in this environment? And I will say that it's so simple. It's so simple. It's not easy. People would get very anxious before, if their team, if they were on a team and they hadn't done this stop, start, continue before. But once they did it, that is, I think, what really made the difference for making those behavioral changes, because it's not anonymous, and that's scary to some people. But sometimes anonymous feedback, like, we just slough it off, we're
Yep.
not we're not really sure. For us, our ego is kind of like, I don't know who it is. It's like, it's probably not important. And then a lot of feedback, when it's written, or these anonymous surveys, it is not specific. It's not specific. So you can say, like, okay, like, I don't think this person really likes the way I do work, but what am I to change? Gosh, I have no idea. And I have no idea where to start. So I think that type of in-person, face-to-face, short, behavioral anchored feedback, stop, start, continue, I have seen now. Making changes for any person is difficult, right?
It's
Especially when you're
difficult.
under stress.
Yep.
And most of these high performance environments, they do come with additional stress.
Plenty, I'm sure.
Yes. And so the nice thing about the face to face feedback done twice a year with your core team is that everyone is vulnerable at the same time, right? And ultimately what it ends up doing is building trust. It builds a language that people can easily use, they're not scared of, right? So I easily now have a way to give you feedback that I didn't have in the past, right? Stop, start, or continue. And the
And
practice, you go ahead.
I
Yeah.
was going to say, and I love that because in my experience, and the data shows this too, It's something like, I think it was Harvard research that shows 87% of employees want more
Yes.
specific, direct,
Yeah.
growth-oriented, focused feedback.
Hmm.
And another study shows that like 80% of managers do not feel comfortable, ready, or prepared. So this stop, start, continue is a really powerful tool to kind of get that conversation going. So please continue, Barb, but
Yeah.
I'm definitely dialing in on this.
Yeah, so what I found was that it ends up building trust with the teams, which is just an awesome and amazing byproduct of giving feedback. It gives you something specific to go after, and then you can kind of measure it over time because every 6 months you're doing this and you're like, oh, yeah, like 6 months ago, my team told me to stop, start, continue this, and then let's see how it's going now. And so it builds that trust. Everyone's vulnerable at the same time. But then the other thing is like, um, once you well, yeah, it gives you something specific and it gives you something to go on. It makes you comfortable so that you have the language so that day to day, even outside of like a formal, we're going to give everybody feedback, everybody come prepared, you can have those developmental conversations, you can give feedback. And so essentially, the team just becomes better and better once they're able to actually use it in the hallways or in their own offices and not wait until that 6 month mark. So you find that
It's huge.
small incremental behavioral changes are made by the team, on their own, even outside of these once they get started.
Well, and once you create that culture of feedback and normalize it, like, hey, my intention's not to criticize you, put you down. I'm not telling you something because I want to disparage you or disparage the efforts that you did, but I'm really just, I want you to be at your best because when you're at your best, I'm at my best, and then we are at our best. But you really do have to spend energy on creating that culture of feedback. Otherwise,
Yeah.
I tend to find that feedback goes better when there's sort of like a higher purpose or a higher level of trust amongst the team. Like, hey, we're all going in the same direction. I'm not telling you this to give you a hard time. We just need everybody firing on all cylinders. And when that seems to occur, that culture of feedback sort of naturally comes into place where it's like, I remember when I was playing hockey, I loved feedback, but
Yeah.
there was times that I got back to the bench and I already knew what I screwed up and I already knew what I needed to stop doing or continue
Yeah.
doing or whatever it was. But even having the coach kind of reinforce some of that of like, this is what I saw, this is how I think you can do this was always for me, even if they were yelling it, I knew that they wanted me to perform better. Not everybody operates that way. I think athletes tend to be okay a little bit with a coach giving them a hard time. But with that being said, I think you nailed it. Being humble enough to take a step back and say, what is this here to teach me? And how
Mhm.
can I operate this going forward? But
Mhm.
yeah, the lack of specificity, I think, is a huge problem in feedback discussions. Like, hey, you did this. Okay, well, what am I supposed to do with that? How am I supposed to operate going forward? Or how does that practically make me better at whatever it is, the task that I'm charged with? So
Yeah. Yeah.
I think one of the things that I find really interesting that you said, and I really love Jocko Willink and his work and all the work that he's done. But one of the things that you said as you're in some of those spaces and you're looking at it, you're able to kind of pull back, have a larger vision of the organization. And that's something that, Jocko talks about all the time in his podcasts or his books about being able to sort of like not have that tunnel vision, not just focus on one thing, but really kind of pull back and see the entire operation. What was it that maybe gave you the ability? Because it seems that that's not an intuitive ability to kind of take that step back, detach, and look at the bigger picture. What was it that maybe, how do you remind yourself to do that every now and then? Because I know myself, I can get sometimes that tunnel vision of like, I got to do this, got to do this. Like, there's a fence, I'm going through that fence. Oh, wait, take a step back, look around and be like, I can go around this fence way easier than going through it. How do you
Yeah.
get yourself to kind of give that visionary sort of pullback to get the broader picture?
I think that if your role isn't already defined within the organization, you should define it.
Mm,
Like people should know why you're there. and what you can help with. And that may expand or retract, right? But you should
Sure.
definitely define your role as best you can. And just that definition and like your mission essential tasks will help keep you focused on what your purpose there is to do. Now, I might have, as far as like observing the themes across the whole organization, you have to get yourself plugged in all over the organization in order to make that happen. So you have to take a lot of risk in just showing up, being an observer, saying, hey, can I just learn more here? Hey, is it okay if I pop into this? I have nothing to say. I just, I want to know more about what you guys do or how you do it. A lot of those types of conversations will help you get the bigger picture, and create the relationships where you can actually keep your pulse on some of those themes. But I think first and foremost, you do need to define your role within the organization, what you're there to do, and keep a list of how, like your mission essential tasks, whether that be 5 or 10, and keep it on your wall, keep it somewhere where you can see it, and then have a teammate that also keeps you accountable. And hopefully you're consulting. I almost all I almost forgot to say that. Like in my mind, that goes without saying, like you are talking to other people about the work that you're doing, because I'm sure you could do great work all by yourself, but you could do better for sure, 100% when you involve other people. Maybe it's just consultative conversations, maybe it's just friendly conversations, or maybe it's more, formal teamwork together. But you're always going to be better when you include other individuals, because they add perspective to what you're doing. So those are the kind of tips I would have for.
It's so smart. That's actually so when I was working with Ford Motor Company and doing consulting with them, one of the things that I did have some of their managers do was like, okay, I want you to go and spend a day with your marketing team. See how they're communicating your products. I want you to go spend a day with the design group, see what challenges or barriers they're facing, and giving them that broader perspective. So here's my advice to you, trainers, coaches, HR people out there. Go sit in the
Mm-hmm.
divisions, the organizations, whatever it is, and learn what their actual challenges are. Because sometimes that does not come through on surveys, it doesn't come through in the polls. But when you're sitting in there, you actually will get a finger on the pulse of what is actually happening and what some of those challenges are. So I think that's a brilliant piece of advice, Barb. Thank you for that. I want to jump into this operational psychology and, timing be damned here. I know we might end up being a little bit longer than a normal episode, but this is just so fascinating to me.
You can turn it
Uh,
off, folks, if you don't want to hear about
that's right.
this.
No. So I'm going to ask, could you help us define what the scope of that is? Because I think that this is going to have some really powerful learnings and insights that we can surface for somebody not necessarily doing operational psychology
Hmm.
in the military, but kind of taking some of those principles. So would you help us define it maybe to start off with?
Sure. I would say that the closest thing, if you just want to kind of keep something in mind as we go along, is going to be an organizational psychologist, or IO psych. So you're in a consultative space, but we were all clinically trained. So we've got all that training in behavioral science and human behavior. Now we use that to consult with our military counterparts. Some of the additional training that we get once we join the service that will help distinguish us from our clinical psychologist counterparts, a few different things. So number one is going to be the area of assessment and selection for special mission units, right? So we're going to spend some time and get supervision on, administering the battery of psychological tests that whatever unit or organization uses to assess people, prior to their kind of work center or selection process. So that's one piece. Clinical psychologists don't do that. What they do is people come to them when they have a problem, they diagnose the problem, they treat the problem. We are looking at healthy individuals for the most part, who are high performing or trying to be high performing individuals. So assessment selection is one piece that we're trained in addition to our clinical foundation. Another piece is going to be SEER psychology, what's called SEER psychology. You might have heard of SEER school. So it's born out of that. So survive, evade, resist, escape. And that part of operational psychology is knowing kind of above and beyond your clinical foundation, how do humans behave when they're captured, isolated, detained, etc. Okay. You can think of many historical examples of POWs and things like that. And operational psychologists are going to be the psychologists that help reintegrate our service members or other citizens once they've been isolated or detained by some kind of enemy or force abroad. Another way that we consult is for the purposes of security or intelligence operations. And so I would say that's kind of in a nutshell. Just again, when what the fourth piece we've already talked about in detail, which is that organizational health piece, right? Like, how are you investing in the culture, right? Like, how are you reinforcing the attributes, or even helping the unit create the attributes that people should strive towards to be most successful in that environment. And coaching, feedback, all that stuff would be that last piece. But that's operational psychology in a nutshell. Most of those things are training after we've had our done our degree and things like that. So is that helpful or?
Huge. So,
Okay.
and interestingly, and I'm not a clinical psychologist. I do focus more on the organization with a focus on individual behaviors within sort of that microcosm of, here's your your behavioral ecology, and I'm going to focus on these tiny behaviors. But having some experience with things like the Minnesota multiphasic, the NEO-PIR, and a number of the other sort of clinical diagnostic tests. And then
Hmm.
also, everybody's always heard of DISC and Myers-Briggs and
Yeah.
Insights and all of these others. And so after studying the science of those, one of the things that kind of inspired me to create an assessment using a different scientific framework was there was I see so much value in it, but I think that sometimes when those assessments are used, they're used in an inappropriate way, at least in the civilian world. Can you help me maybe share? Can you share maybe a little bit about your perspective? I'm sure that you've
Hmm.
seen a disc training where it's just like, Barb, you're a high D, and this means that you're going to do X, Y, and Z. And you're a very low C, so you're not going to be able to, exhibit. Let's talk about this because I think
Yeah.
that there's a huge problem with assessments and the way they're deployed in the general working world.
Yeah.
Let's talk
It can
about
be
the
really
difference maybe a
dangerous
little.
if
Yeah.
you're not careful with it. I think they're very powerful tools. They can be, power for good or power for bad. So on the assessment and selection side, the formal assessment and selection process, those tools have been around for quite a while. They're tried and true, scientific backing for that purpose, right? And we wouldn't use things like the DISC or the MBTI for assessment selection.
Thank
Um,
you.
yeah, that might get us even into some legal trouble because that's not why those were created, and that's not their purpose. And so, trying to make assumptions about people's behavior or capabilities or abilities based on those tests is inaccurate and dangerous. But once people are in your organization, hopefully, if there's already been some type of assessment up front in the hiring process, first and foremost, you're going to debrief that. And um, the assessment selection process for military organizations has been through legal review over and over again. So I would say be careful if your organization wants to use an assessment prior to hiring, there are laws around that. And you don't want to you don't want to meddle in that. Now,
Oh,
if your
and
hiring
you're
process
and you're
is,
the
yeah,
other thing, and this is something I always advise, DISC and Myers-Briggs and a number of those other sort of generic off the shelf are not designed for selection process.
no,
That's not their purpose. Please don't use those. The tools that you're speaking of, Barb, are obviously significantly different than
yeah,
those types of assessments. So I,
right.
I I can't echo that enough. And this has been part of my crusade of like, why are you doing this? This is not good for
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
And if you want
Go
to think
ahead,
about it
please.
in a certain way, think about it, take yourself as the case example, I would say, right? Like I know you've taken some kind of assessment and you're like, yeah, people could think a certain way about me or my behavior based on this. It's not really expressed this way in this environment, right? You wouldn't want to have assumptions made about you that are incorrect. And I certainly do not want to be the one making incorrect assumptions. So use the assessments, I would say post hire for most organizations, but yeah, use them as an onboarding process to invest in every new hire.
Mhm.
How will they feel like you're investing in them? Number one, it's a little bit of money for some of these assessments. Number two, hopefully it's kind of like in a group and individual setting, so they get to know their teammates around them. Their first day in the door, that's going to help them feel, a sense of belonging. But you just spending extra time with them, extra attention on them as a person will also, kind of cement their commitment to the company up front. So I would say they're very powerful tools. Do not over assume on the tools. I would be more curious than anything else. We have them drive
Great advice.
discussion.
Yes, great advice. Uh,
Yeah, let
the curiosity thing, I mean, that's exactly like, hey, this is the start of a conversation, not
exactly.
here's the box that you're in. Now go behave
Yep,
that way for the rest of
yep,
your days. So
yes.
continue on that, Barbara. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but as soon as
Oh
you said that,
no.
I'm just like, oh, thank you. Yes, that's exactly a big point of like utilizing it as a tool for onboarding. Brilliant. For
Mm-hmm.
coaching,
Yep.
for inquiry, for engagement, for curiosity-based coaching opportunities, 100%. So
Or if
yeah,
individuals have their own goals in mind, then even easier to select an assessment that's kind of focused around the goals that they already have as an individual and say like, yeah, let's just see where you're at and get the discussion going that way and talk about it. But yeah, I would say even with high performers, when we give them assessments, and this is post hire, this is when they've arrived at the unit, because we do want them to get to know each other. Now, the risk involved in their job is different than most teams, right? It's a little bit higher. We want initially right out of the gate for them to trust one another with their own lives.
yeah.
So there's a big task in front of us to really dig deep early. I would say that most organizations don't have the same requirement to dig deep early. I would say go ahead and dig deep. Like, what's it going to get you? Really committed individuals that trust one another. Like, how can that be bad? But anyway, it can be time intensive. So um, even in these high performing environments, there is a tendency for any person, once they see some kind of result on some kind of test that seems scientific, to put themselves in a box, right? And then to have that temptation of making excuses kind of for their behavior rather
That's
than
just
just
how I am.
yes, exactly. So what we say is like this is an assessment, like this is just kind of how you're answering these questions today. It helps you learn more about who you are so that you don't say this is just who I am, so that you know that there are more opportunities for different behaviors as you encounter and interact with people who are different from you. And so knowing as much as you can about your teammates and yourself is just going to expedite that process and make it more fun and fluid, getting to know one another, giving each other feedback and stuff like that. But
It's
yeah,
great.
we have even specific conversation about like don't ever say like, oh, it's because if you're using the disc, oh, because you're a D or you're a C. Like no, that's baby
Thank you.
stuff, right? Like
Yeah.
we're trying to walk, run, and fly here. So
Yeah, well, and thank you for that because it's so important when we think about what we can justify with just being like, well, I guess that's my personality, that's how I am. We challenge that at every single turn and just like, no, that's how you're choosing to be because your core individual self, whether you want to look at it as the chemicals that make up your body, guess what? Those are one stimuli. Your environment's another stimuli. Your upbringing, your genetics, your epigenetics, all of those are stimuli. But at the end of the day, your behavior is your
yes,
choice.
And isn't
And
that
you
so powerful and exciting?
It is. It is.
Yeah.
It's inspirational to say, you know what, I am the master of my own behavioral destiny. But
Yeah.
I really think that that sort of like block that we have as humans oftentimes puts us in that position of go, I can't change it. And it's really what our brain is saying is, I don't want to change it. It's hard to change it. That this
It's hard.
pattern, yeah,
Yeah.
this pattern, I know what the end result of this pattern of behavior is. I don't know what the end result of a new pattern of behavior is.
Yeah.
So that fear and uncertainty kind of blocks us. But I love what you're saying here because it is so important to not get locked to say, I can't shift this because of my personality or because this
Yeah.
is what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah. And what these assessments should be teaching us is a curiosity and respect for diversity, a respect for differences. The more
Mhm.
diverse and different the people on your team are, like the more potential you have, right, for any mission set. The worst thing we could do with an assessment, and you see it happening, I know, is people taking them on as like a label, and it's like something that they're proud of, like, oh, I'm a D on the disc, you know, like they're better than other letters or other types of personality or people who have other behavioral defaults. That's the worst thing you could do. The best thing you can do is just take it as like, wow, I'm so curious about how this person responds. I'm curious about how they could contribute to the team. I'm so thankful that people have different defaults, you know, than myself. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Oh, it makes a ton of sense. So actually the assessment that we use, the behavioral elements, it's not you're one or the other, we're all four. It's a hierarchical decision-making process. So my
Mm-hmm.
strongest drive is my drive to acquire. My second strongest is my drive to learn. My executive assistant, hers is the drive to defend, and then followed by the drive to acquire. The defend drive is our structure process, managing risk, overcoming, creating systems. That is my least. And
Right?
when the two of us are working together, she provides structure. So I come in and I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, I've got this great idea. Let's do this. And it's like, okay, Jay,
Mm-hmm.
let's take a step back. How will we do this? What's the operation? And really walks me through it. She appreciates my innovation. I appreciate her structuring to make sure that I'm not just, now all of a sudden studying polar bear habits in the middle of the Antarctic when it has nothing to do with what we're actually
Right.
trying to do for the mission.
Yeah.
So I think it's so important. You had mentioned that diversity. There's a lot of different types of diversity out there. Obviously, there's the ones that we all know about and hear about constantly about the different intersections. And we do a lot of work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but different intersections of race and culture and education and so on and so forth. But I do think I'd love for you to kind of talk about that a little bit about the diversity of these different assessments, because I think that's an underlying diversity that's often not looked at is how do each of your members show up in these different sort of assessments that they're able to look at. Somebody who's very, very open, or,
Right.
I'm just using the Neo PIR, for example, somebody who's very,
Mm-hmm.
very open versus somebody who's very agreeable, and how those things can interact to create a higher performance team. Can you comment a little bit more on that, Barb? I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I think we always present it this way is, and I just did it recently, had a whole team, right, take an assessment, but then the way I debrief it is as a team. So you can see everyone all at the same time, and you can see the differences all in one picture. And then two of the main questions I always ask are like, um, how do you see this showing up on your team? I don't know what they're going to say. And I just let them sit with the question. Right. And then we talk about, yeah, what are the strengths of this team? Looking at, your structure as a team, not anyone as an individual. Okay. And what are some areas that we might need to work really hard on, or try to set up like an additional structure for accountability? So, one that is, one example is like, if everyone on a team is high in agreeableness, already you can say like, okay, yeah, like we're going to have a really hard time giving, any kind of critical feedback or sharing our feelings if we think they're vulnerable, or they might,
Drawing
like,
boundaries. Yeah.
yeah. So all those kinds of things. And then to be able to talk about it as a team, and then and then put in some structure like, okay, well, this is us unique as a team. What are some ways that we can put structure around that or accountability around that so that we know we can still get the benefits of having diversity on agreeableness, like having someone that's willing to speak up first and call things out without, that being anyone's default. So that's just one example, but yeah, so I'm talking about diversity in life experience, diversity in personality, yeah,
Mhm.
diversity in the way that we take risks or make decisions, think creatively, or keep people to a structure, like all of those things. Really, us as a person, not necessarily as those other identifiable qualities that people mention when they're talking about diversity.
And we kind of divide it out a little bit by inherent diversity, meaning the diversity that we were born into, and acquired diversity. The diversity that we've acquired either through education or lack of education, or through socioeconomic status, et cetera. And a number of different things. And when we think about it, kind of goes into that whole nature versus nurture thing. But at the end of the day, it's both, right? So
Right.
yeah, my experience, we could be born genetic twins, grow up in different environments, and while we might share some aspects that's coming from the genetic side, we're also going to have very, very different approaches or lenses or experiences to look through. And I think that that's really important when we think about diversity of how is, personality, how is experience and that knowledge acquisition, how is it, that my life experiences also contribute to multiple different, intersections that we can look at. Barb, this has been one of the most fascinating conversations, and I'm confident that I could continue to talk to you for an hour. And
I know, we're just going to keep going.
I know, right? One of the things that I would like to do is, I know that you have some experience and knowledge in burnout, and I would love to invite you back to the show to actually kind of focus a little energy on burnout, because I think, again, the applications that you're doing this at that level could really, really contribute to the larger audience and that civilian side of
Mhm.
things. But I don't want to cheapen it by just saying, all right, talked about burnout. And then, so if it would be okay with you, I would love to do a part two with you at some point in time and really kind of focus a little bit on that burnout and how do we
Yeah.
manage people when they do experience some kind of deep-seated trauma, or because
Hmm.
trauma, and we're learning more and more about trauma, that it's not always a capital T trauma, but each of us
Right.
experiences trauma on a daily basis. It's a continuum, and it's something that sticks with us. I think it would be really fascinating to have a deeper conversation about those things, because I know that it's something that organizations are struggling with right now.
Right.
So with your permission, I would love to invite you back for that conversation. um,
I would love to have a longer conversation about burnout. I appreciate that you don't want to just throw it out there. We dealt with burnout as a serious problem in one of those high performing units that I've mentioned, and I would love to get into the weeds about how we handled that.
That would be great. And actually, I do a lot of burnout work with healthcare and
Hmm.
started that process during COVID. So I think that could be a really, really powerful. So, audience, stay tuned for part two, where we are going to dig into that. But, Barb, how would our audience get in touch with you if they wanted to reach out, if they wanted to connect with you, and even just share their gratitude for the work that you're doing, for, the military in our country?
Sure. You can find me on LinkedIn, send me a message, or I'd love to connect on there. It's probably the easiest way to find me. And then a couple of the organizations that I work with, you can get me through their websites as well. So shieldsandstripes.org is one way that you can look me up, and counterculturesolutions.com is another way. And those are both military related organizations. One is nonprofit and one is a for-profit solution. So reach out any way you can, but those would be three ways to find me.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time and your insights. I think this was such a great conversation and lots to take away for our audience, Barb. Really appreciate you taking the time to be here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a blast.
And thank you, audience, for tuning into this episode of the Talent Forge, where we are shaping the future of training and development.